Okay. All right. So now we are going to get, I guess we haven't done this before. I'm just going to go through the readings. And we will, we'll see what happens. Please do jump in, ask questions. All right. So let's start with a bunch of the readings were about the Inter-American system generally, the overview, history, and purpose of the system. Okay. So that'll be let's sort of talk about that first. The American Declaration was drafted and signed in June 1948, I think, so 6 months even before the Universal Declaration. So the idea of human rights was very active in the hemisphere, and it's actually sort of part of this unique relationship that the hemisphere has to human rights that is different. Now, I think we're probably more familiar with the model that the European system followed. Okay, they created an institution. The institution had certain powers. It leveraged those powers, and off we go, right? And it's a binding court system, and it's not binding as with maybe precisely the same full force that our Supreme Court has, but it's a binding system. It's had a profound effect. Its rulings are largely complied with. Now that's changing a little bit as the European as the system of, or the Council of Europe, which is that broader set of European states, right, broader than the EU, grows. Even the nature of the European system is also changing. Different history with the Inter-American system. Okay, so after 1948, it doesn't proceed kind of to build institutions and develop out. Things move very, very slowly. Okay, so it's not. At first, it's just a declaration. There's no institutions whatsoever. The Inter-American Commission is finally created 10 years later. It takes another 10 years to get to the Inter-American Convention, which is right, the difference between a declaration, which is explicitly non-binding, just aspirational statement of principles, versus a convention, which is purportedly legally binding. Whether or not states sign up to enforcement mechanisms is a different question, but they do say this is legally binding on us as international legal personality, as states within the international system. We hereby agree with our neighbors. This is legally binding. Now, what does that mean? Why also? Why are states agreeing to do that? We're going to talk about that in a second. But it takes another 10 years to get there, okay, to do the Inter-American Convention. And then we don't, the convention clearly contemplates a court of human rights, and yet it takes another 10 years to get the court of human rights up in 1979. It's the Pact of San Jose, and there's just a ton of politics and regional stuff about this. But in 1979, which is also like a very difficult time for the hemisphere, with lots of sort of authoritarian regimes and just tons of human rights abuses, it's sort of an acknowledged problem of human rights abuses in the system. The court finally comes up in 1979, and it takes another 10 years. And so you can see the first judgment of the Inter-American Court coming out in 1987, I think, or it starts takes hearing petitions in the late 80s. It may not even be until 1988 that the decision, it was the Velasquez-Rodriguez decision that we looked at, right? So a slow, tortured process with a lot of push and pull. Okay, and you see this in some of the readings. The region is characterized by the kinds of forced disappearances and authoritarian regimes and repressive government tactics, in a way that the core of the European system was not, arguably. I mean, that's certainly that's how it's framed by James Caballero in his article. And also that it had, that there were explicit challenges to the authority of the court system and the authority of the commission in the court, and the human rights within the hemisphere from the beginning. And that's quite true, and it's still very, very true today. And why is that? Why is that so difficult, where other regions are accepting the authority of human rights, and you've got a profound faith in human rights, we'll talk about in a second, in the hemisphere? Why is this? Why is the authority of the Inter-American human rights system so consistently, constantly undermined and challenged in this nature of the struggle with it, right? Because the reality is there is a deep, authentic attachment to human rights within the system. There's the little snippet in the case book from Celia Medina, and she talks about how the creators of the commission did not foresee the appeal that it would have. So in 1959, right, The state sat down and said, oh, okay, we've got this declaration. Let's do a high-level commission, that will look at human rights issues and kind of issue reports. First of all, right, the idea was, well, it'll study how things stand in the hemisphere with respect to human rights. And what happens is that there's severe human rights violations all over the hemisphere at that point in time. A lot of people are at war with their government, in tension with their governments in lots of different ways. And the commission immediately starts receiving direct appeals in a way that there was no procedural mechanism for that in place. Started receiving thousands of direct appeals, especially from Argentina, which was at the time Argentina and Chile. And so what's at stake? What's going on? Like, why isn't this just abandoned at that point in history, right? Like why? And when I start to ask that question, I start to ask, well, we've talked about this earlier in the semester. Why are states doing this anyway? Like, why are we doing human rights treaties? If you really care about human rights, just don't, your country, your government, you care about human rights, just, whatever, lead with your own actions. Don't violate human rights. Do the best you can to uphold human rights within your own conduct. Why are different states getting together to make these promises, right? A treaty is just a promise in between multiple different states. We talked about that earlier, about how, what's the consequence for violating a treaty? Consequence for violating a treaty is that maybe your treaty partners would then consider themselves not bound. Well, you broke the promise, so then we'll not. So is that if one country to a human rights treaty violates the treaty, is the threat that another country will then start violating human rights to get back at you? And some of it there's some easy answers, right? Some of them are not easy answers, but some factors that we know are there, right? Like citizens groups, civil society, right? We saw that way back to the abolition of slavery. That social groups in Britain were, going to the town squares and pressuring council ministers and just demanding that the British government go and take steps at the international sphere to try to eliminate the scourge of the slave trade. So domestic politics, and that's just politics of conscience, okay? And so to some degree, civil society actors are there. But let's not pretend that civil society actors are the puppeteers of national governments. That's not our experience. That's just not how things typically operate. They have a voice. What is your interest in, why are you working to create a consensus on human rights through a legal instrument, through any sort of an instrument in the 1970s? When I clip this video, I'll cut out the big pause while people are like,
could we say that it's really just an attempt at an appearance of adhering to human rights? I mean, would that appearance be valuable for them, I guess?
Yeah. So these are all going to be factors. That's certainly a factor, of course. Maybe today, let's say, in a time when the expectations of human rights are deeply, deeply entrenched, and maybe they were in the 70s too. It was a big growth time for human rights framework. But when you say appearance, is it need to be appearance enforced by sanctions? By, you're not going to get trade deals. You're going to get, maybe there's a threat of divestment or something. I mean, why is just appearance actually important?
Well, I mean, maybe that sort of touches on it, the idea that, I don't know, globalism was sort of expanding at an increasingly rapid pace. Because I don't know, my history that well, but I could imagine that at a time like that, they might have began to realize the incentives for sort of, I don't know, keeping up appearances in that way. I'm sure it's always been an issue, but there may have been increases. Also with the increase in maybe TV, media.
Yeah, and Argentina was getting a lot of military aid from the US at the time, right? So, I imagine the United States wouldn't really want a partner who was on their face doing bad things. So at least someone who commits to doing good things.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, there were big political, and at that point it was during the Carter presidency, Jimmy Carter, who was actually made human rights part of his foreign policy and so forth. So I'm not totally sure how much direct pressure there was on Argentina with respect to the Human Rights Commission, but absolutely, that's a factor. Okay, well, to the extent it is command and control in that sense, in the sense that like we have decided there is a human rights instrument and you need to comply with it, even if you don't want to. And here are the pressures and expectations the international system are going to put on you. That's I think that's obviously a layer, a dimension for sure. Although it's interesting now in our next discussion, we'll kind of plug that into, well, where again, kind of this cultural distinction or imperialist distinction, because there's a separate type of imperialism operating in the hemisphere. Okay. The Inter-American Commission and Court are actually technically creatures of the Organization of American States, which is funded and a lot of within the hemisphere considered to be controlled by the United States, whatever it sits in the United States. It's unclear, but there's a whole separate kind of imperialism debate happening right within the hemisphere where Central and South American countries have resisted, right, the imperialism of the Monroe Doctrine, like where the U.S. is like, hey, this is our hemisphere, we get to control what happens here. Well, that's often studied in relation to like global politics, but like what's the response of the Latin American countries who are within the right sort of the protective skirt of the United States. So there's a lot of that gives rise to a lot of the tensions that we'll see when we even in the current day. So, but is it really just command and control? How do we think about the state's own desire to respect human rights with Argentina? Is there anything there? Are they just like forgetting about it, or I mean, they like this is just the wrong way to think about it?
I mean, if we want to go back to the beginning of the semester with the cultural relativism talk, we could say that they really do want to respect human rights. They just don't have the same vision of human rights as Eurocentric countries do.
Yeah, right. It's a little too easy to be like, they just don't care about what, I mean, human rights is huge, it's broad, right? It's human dignity. Let's not pretend that the entire country and even the government, even the military dictatorship government, doesn't care about human dignity, right? So there is something going on there, right? And and I think that's where this idea of appeal is. Now, why, right? So on the one hand, like we can't characterize states as just a single thinking entity, right? States are going to be comprised, even within the government, there can be factions within the government there's politics at play and different groups that are going to be pushing for more adherence to a human rights framework versus other types of frameworks, right? But there's also going to be different ways of trying to express that. Otherwise, trying to express values or get to values that are different, right? Because on page 886, which is part of a speech from sort of the leading general of the military junta in Argentina, right? Roberto Viola. And so he writes, this war, like all wars, has a dimension that is different from the value of life. I mean, that's like, we're not allowed to say that, but it's totally true, right? Like war doesn't proceed under a framework that privileges the value of life, right? For that reason, it is a war. Dams and barriers are broken. Life and death are gambled away in the pursuit of victory. The worst thing is not the loss of life. The worst thing is to lose the war, right? So that's the different frame. And it's true, right? It explains the decision to go to war, of every war, right? And so that's how right? This is how the society, not just the society, but the government that's in place at the time is seeing the policy framework, if you will, of what's happening in the country, right? For that reason, the army, which today has restored the value of life, according to Viola, can say to the country that we have carried out our mission. This is the only, and we believe, the sufficient explanation. The price of this is known to the country, and to the army too. This war, like all wars, has an aftermath, tremendous wounds that time and only time can heal. These wounds are a number of casualties, the dead, the wounded, the detainees, the ones who are absent forever. The army knows it and feels it because it is not inhumane or insensitive. Now he sort of shifts to the terrorists, right, that they were going after, with unbridled arrogance, believed that by assassinations they could break the will to win the armed forces and the immense majority of the population. Unfortunately, the terrorists were men and women who had been born on this generous soil. They were wrong, they were deceived, and they deceived and darkened the land of their birth. They deceived their supporters, whose anxiety they provoked, which nobody today can legitimately assuage. The circumstances will undoubtedly widen the breach left in the wake of the war, because blameless families afflicted by pain are also Argentine. The army knows this and feels this. Its only explanation is the liberty which our homeland entrusted to it for safekeeping. Like, this is the regime, this is the leader of the regime that inflicted all the enforced disappearances that are sort of talked about in the readings, and that maybe you're aware of from other types, which is, I consider, one of the main human rights problems in the hemisphere, and is horrific, absolutely horrific stories of torture and death and so forth. But, right, this is still a clash of perspective. It's still a clash of what is best for the country. And I don't sort of say that to validate that regime or its conduct, but to say that to understand that the struggle that's happening here, that when the human rights system is engaging with these regimes, right, it's part of it is trying to work on values and to drag and to shift these kinds of passions in a direction to understand, to put a different type of framework around it, right? And to some extent, why would you, when I think about what we're doing with human rights treaties, here you've got someone who's clearly demonizing their enemies, who sees themselves in an existential war, right? But this blends into a persistent problem through today about national security and about how much does an authoritarian regime allow dissident groups to operate and so forth. By adding that collective dimension to it, are you empowering each individual state to do more, right? And to sort of say, well, okay, we're taking the way that this framework sees that's taking a risk. And is it easier to take that kind of a risk in consensus with other states, right? And not just in the national security realm, right? If we as a society are going to say, I mean, if you think about economic competition between countries, for a state to say, okay, we're going to respect a right to housing or other types of rights, is it easier for a state to do that if they're acting pursuant to a pact with other states that are going to do it? Right? Is it sort of holding each state's best intentions, commitments, a way of enforcing those commitments, or in a way of sort of consecrating those commitments in a collectivity, which has probably lots of different ways, not only kind of an enforcement, but also sort of seeing different dimensions about how different rights relate and how they can relate to society. So, I think there's a lot more, there's a way of, I guess the main thing is to encourage you to think about, yes, states are acting according to pressures from the external system, but each state itself has a very sort of complex mix of motivations within it. This constant war between states hostile to this process of international adjudication, international review, and yet also pushing it forward at the same time. Okay.